been enough thought about governance mechanisms and accountabilities, but you're still much better at that than we are, and we've got some things to learn there. But there's also then this sort of horizontal question. So there's joined-up commissioning, which really is where commissioning starts. I mean, it begins in the 80s with this question of the enabling authority. It was never the enabling state. That was not the original conversation. That's a piece of sort of academic gloss that came later on. It was about how do you make the social care and health system coherent for the people who have to negotiate it. Stop just obsessing with the bit that you deliver. Think about how this works for the individual. But then the other side of it is, as we've moved into, and firstly acknowledged that we have got markets, and there's been, of course, a lot more marketisation done. This question of sort of market design and stewardship, sort of more open and contestable systems. And so it's in that context that I guess we want to sort of speak this afternoon. Let me start off by just contextualising this, and I oscillate between using the word system and market. The word system is so general that it doesn't really capture the particular kind of systems we're dealing with. The trouble with the word market is that people immediately think about, and particularly the economists, immediately think about commoditised markets. And these things are basically not. These are not paperclip markets for paperclips. So a lot of this is about how do we think about government. I mean, there was a time when people thought about government essentially as a machine. And it was just about the efficient working of a machine. And you'll still see that particular mindset appear in various ways, that, particularly from the centre, the ways that they engage with and talk about what they need to do to make things work better. There is an alternative metaphor, because these are all just metaphors, where there's a tendency to view government as a big corporation, and in that case management is an org chart and memos sent from the people on the 22nd floor to the people on the second floor about how they should behave. And that government as corporation approach is one that I battle with a lot in the Australian context, particularly with right-of-centre governments where they bring their mates in from the private sector and they just think in terms of how a bank works. The commissioning approach, I think, is built on. This is the Mercato Centrale in Florence. I was off earlier this year, and I was to deliver and speak in Canada, and I took a photo of the Mercato Centrale because I thought it captured that. It's an economy that it has a regulatory, has a roof and a framework and a regulatory environment and a set of rules and relationships, but it is nevertheless an economy of different sized firms. And whether those firms are public or private or not-for-profit, that's really what we're dealing with. It's more, not necessarily a market, but certainly an economy. And so if you think about it that way, it leads you to this really interesting question. This is a sort of the people who I think did the earliest clean thinking about this, Vincent and Eleanor Ostrom. She's the first woman to get a Nobel Prize in economics, and she got it for cooperation theory, not for competition theory, interestingly. But this is some earlier work she did with her husband in the 70s and 80s, and it was at the time when economists were beginning to study the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union as an economy, and they said it is an economy. It may be centrally planned, but it's still an economy, and economics has something to say about that. And I think they sort of thought, oh, here's another centrally planned economy, the public service economy. Economics has something to say in that space. And so, it may not be a market, but it is an economy, and it has a supply side and a demand side. And that sort of commissioning mindset underlies that. And what you find, you sort of are aware of how mixed your economy is. Australia, the numbers, you look at sort of these numbers here, their order of magnitude, the sort of stuff that you'd have here. I teach a commissioning academy in Ontario. They sort of thought they were in a different environment, and it was all very terribly different. And no, there's some things they don't do. They don't contract prisons, but they do other things. And then I was in Ireland last year, and they're a very traditional public service, but in reality they have a lot more external provision of public services because of the traditional role of the churches in Ireland. They just don't commission them terribly well. They're just a really crude old-fashioned grant system. So this is sort of, this mixed economy is not something that is uniquely British. It's certainly not something that's unique to the English-speaking world either. The public service economies of Denmark and Sweden and France, places in Germany we would think of as sort of more socialist, they have a lot of external provision, and including private provision in their systems. So we are dealing with a mixed economy. Commissioning is inextricably linked to this, the idea of a mixed economy. It is dealing with that, public, private, and not-for-profit. And even if you were to substantially reduce the role of the private and not-for-profit sectors, you're still going to have a mixed economy because you've got all the local authorities, you've got NHS trusts who are sort of have a semi-independent. This is just simply, it is what it is. The public-private mix may change somewhat, and the origins of this in this country, in my view, go back to the work done in the 80s on joined-up commissioning, the enabling authority, and the concept of the executive agency, the Next Steps report, which was this separation of the delivery people and a recognition of the importance of the delivery function as separate from in that case, the policy function. But are we talking about a market? And if we are talking about a market, what sort of market is it? I absolutely love, my wife's a sculptor, I love this statue because by just putting that additional figure in there, that entire narrative, what we're thinking about there is instantly transformed. It's utterly changed. And the guy, it's a piece of plonk art, it was not commissioned. It was dumped in there in the middle of the night by a I think an Italian artist. And he's furious that somebody has plonked a little girl in front of it because it's utterly transformed what he was wanting to say in that space. There's lots of different kinds of markets, and I'm just going to stick with that word because, but I am conscious of the danger of doing so because, I was at the industry dinner the other night, and I don't know if I was mentioning this to somebody, I don't think the group. I was talking to one of the chief executives who was an economist. The chief executive of one of the large companies who's an economist. And we were also speaking to a senior, the group was involved a senior civil servant, and I used the word market, and he said, oh, it's not a market. And his mind immediately went to the kind of market that economists study, which are commodity markets. But we have all these other kinds of markets, some of which don't even involve price. But there is this danger when we use that term that the mind slips across. And we see this, you'll see it in this case study we'll come to in a minute around National Disability Insurance Scheme in Australia, that the policymakers are going, no, we don't need to think about the design and functionality of the supply side, the market will fix that. And this is bullshit. It's just, what market? That's the problem, there isn't a market. We've got to design one, we've got to create a space that these will occupy. We have to help to build capability, we've got to create a culture, we have all of these other things. And so there's lots of different kinds of markets. An auction is a market, but that's very different from a kidney exchange. We'll have a look at these in a minute, which is very different from a corporate supply chain, which is another form of market. One of my favourite examples of this is C-3PO, not that C-3PO, but this one, the NASA's Commercial Crew and Cargo Program. And this was set up by the Democrats and to do this. This is Elon Musk. Those of you who recognise Elon Musk, he's sort of much more recognisable now, owns SpaceX. And they were one or two companies to get a contract to put commercial capability into space. And so this is all about this fabulous story of, I mean, I have followed the SpaceX side of it. There is another one, but we all sort of tend to focus on the SpaceX contributions leading right through, of course, until their replaceable rocket. When this was put to Congress, the Republicans said, why aren't you just doing a procurement and down selecting to the cheapest bidder? And the Democrats, left of centre, said, no, you misunderstand, we're creating a market. To implement US space exploration policy with an investment to stimulate commercial enterprises in space. To facilitate US private industry demonstration of cargo and crew space transportation capabilities with the goal of achieving reliable, cost-effective access to low Earth orbit, and to create a market environment in which commercial space transportation services are available to government and private sector customers. They were wanting to build a market, and that was a different brief, a different challenge to outsourcing something that, you know, the sort of traditional, let's get, you know, NASA, let's build a rocket. For those of you that don't know, I earlier this year published a report called Just Another Paperclip for the Business Services Association, a rather provocative, deliberately provocative piece. Not overstated, can I tell you? I underwrote it. One of a number of points I was trying to make was that the skills and the systems and the tools you'd use to create a market or to access a market for buying paper clips are profoundly different from the kinds of tools and instruments you need for accessing social care. Care for individuals with complex need. Okay, so we have a variety of tools. Voucher markets, personal budgets, individualised budgets, they're vouchers. Okay, people don't like using that word. It is the term of art. They are what they are. Now, we've used these things in lots of different places. The American food stamp was a voucher. Rental vouchers, for low-income housing. We've used that for some time. Legal aid, we've used it in the legal aid space. Australians carry around a healthcare card, a bit different to how it works here. We carry around a introduced by a Labor government. We carry around a green card like that, and we can go to any doctor of our choice. So in the middle of the day, if I need to go to a doctor, I don't need to stay at home or go home. I can just go to a medical, if it's basic, I will just go to a medical centre in town to get the service I want. And it's bulk billed, mostly. Some doctors may charge a little extra, but almost all doctors, it'll just go on the card. It's a voucher. In that case, it's a physical artefact that you carry around with you. In Australia, we have choice of about 35% of students will finish their education in a private school in Australia. You actually have more private education than your system counts, because the sort of grant-funded church-based schools got tipped under a category called public. We just have that category. They're privately run, they have their own culture, they just happen to be funded under a voucher. Now in this case there's no physical artefact, the money just follows the child. They can just tote up how many children you've got and the money gets allocated accordingly. I remember I was present when I heard Milton Friedman in the 70s asked the question, do you think we should build a voucher system for the schools in Australia? And he looked a bit confused and said, but you have one. We don't think of it as a voucher system, it is what it is. It's not necessarily terribly well designed or fair. It works well enough. By and large, Australians are comfortable with it, and the inclination has been to tinker at the margin. I will talk about vocational education. We have moved into doing vouchers in that. I'll talk about that in a minute. It's been one of our disasters. And then the case study I'll look at is the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is the mother of all voucher schemes being done for people with disability.
And another disaster.
Sorry?
And another disaster.
It is going to be a disaster. We're going to keep doing it. I have stopped working for the National Disability Insurance Agency, but in one of my sessions with the senior management, I said there are two truisms that you need to embrace. The first one is, and these are not a criticism of you, it is a comment on the task you have been given. Firstly, you don't know what you're doing, and secondly, you're going to fail repeatedly. Now, you just build that in so that you need to learn, sort of make your mistakes, make them quickly and learn. I mean, it's just, that's not to criticise them, it is just the challenge they have been given, but we'll come back to that. So there's an architecture to voucher markets. There is almost no literature on this. It is one of a huge number of areas in the topics that we're talking about where the literature is small and immature. But essentially you're playing with a variety of different variables. Eligibility, will this be universal as it is with the Medicare card, or will it be targeted, which for example it is for people with a disability? We're not offering that to everybody, we're offering it to certain people with certain disabilities. Will coverage, will there be an unlimited claim for costs, or are we expecting a patient moiety, a user contribution, and so on? The means of payment, will it be at an explicit card, or will it be hidden the way it is with education? Market segmentation, will we allow cream skimming? So in our system in Australia, there is private schools are able to choose. That of course can have problems for equity. In the Netherlands, where they, for the same reason we have a voucher scheme in Australia, which is we had the Protestants in charge of government who were basically introduced a government-funded school and wanted to use education as a way of re-educating Catholic children, and the Catholics weren't happy about that, and they established their own education system. The Netherlands have a voucher system in education for precisely the same reason. It was decided at some point that it was only fair that the Catholics, who are not terribly well off, shouldn't have to pay twice for an education system. But in the Netherlands, you're not allowed, the schools are not allowed to cream skim. They have got to take all comers. So different countries have sort of different rules on that, based on ethos and politics. Information failure. What kind of assistance will the people who go shopping for the service need, and how much support will we mandate that they should be given? And then questions of the supply side, the need to control the supply side and manage and regulate the supply side. And we'll see this coming up in NDIS, and which we'll look at shortly. My point about that is just simply to say that there's a set of disciplines associated with designing a voucher market. The literature is very dispersed because we won't call them vouchers and think about them as a tool, and therefore we don't access the wide repertoire of case studies we have in order to bring them together to understand what it is we're dealing with. This is a job that is still to be done.
In coverage, could you have rationing as well? Because you might have a situation where there isn't user contribution, but there is either explicit or implicit rationing.
Mm-hmm.
It was used to be done by queues in the NHS.
Yep.
Now done by NICE, by the National Institute for Health and Investment.
So yeah, yes. This is one of the brute fact rationing is either done by queue, price, or mandate. Somebody's saying, sorry, but you die, you don't, and so yeah. Yep. Yes. So I mean, this is, we'll sort of come back on a voucher scheme in a minute, but even then there isn't really time to study this. But I know of two books on this where there is an introductory chapter which talks about architecture per se, and one essay in a European journal. It is just not. So those of you who are grappling with personalised budgets and design, if you're finding you're grappling and having trouble finding people who can assist, don't be surprised. Everyone has the same problems. A different kind of market. This guy here, Alvin Roth, got the 2012 Nobel Prize in Economics, and I've got to tell you, anyone with a face like that, he must be a lovely guy to know. I like his face. He got his Nobel Prize for work on what are called matching markets. In reality, it's actually a particular subset of matching markets, clearinghouses. And it was for kidney matching. These are non-price markets, and the problem is, how do I create a large system which allocates kidney donors to kidney recipients. So it may well be that I've got a kidney that I'd like to donate to my daughter who needs one, but we're not compatible. Well, if we can get a two-way trade and there's somebody else where the match works conveniently the other direction, fine. But what if in fact it needs to be a three-way or a four-way trade in order to clear? Because these things can't sit around for very long and wait. And so he designed the algorithms, and he calls it a market. He drew on market principles to design a clearinghouse for kidney matching. So kidney matching is, his original work was done with finding optimal placements in hospital for medical interns. Some work has been done on school placements, and there's a little bit of work being done in Australia on non-emergency patient transportation, using these algorithms to allocate people within an ambulance system in a large city so that you don't have dead legs, you don't have ambulances travelling for non-emergency work, travelling that's empty at the same time as another car is being called out from somewhere else to cover the same journey. So we're playing with this and using market learnings. No price involved. Money's not an issue in this particular market. Competitive selection, competitive tendering. I won't drill down into this. I know I distinguish it from contracting. They are two connected systems, but they are different systems and they have different rules. There's the Dutch auction, just simply a highly pressured environment where you're bidding against the clock. Reverse internet auctions. And then there's the way that we choose a senior executive or a chief executive, and that we eyeball each other and we decide whether we're compatible. It is the language that's used in some of the literature borrows from the literature around finding a mate, finding a partner. It's about matching, and there's no correct answer. It's not I can rate these people according to some objective measure. It's they sort of tick the boxes, but I want to see if there's fit. It's a much more complex process, inevitably a much more complex process. And there's some nice economics around this. The other thing that's really, really interesting about this is that what you're doing as you do this is you're building trust. I mean, so if we now go across to the finding a partner for life, or a partner, why don't I hire a private inquiry agent to check out this person to make sure that they're everything I want them to be? Well, because there's two things going on at the same time. One, I'm trying to select a suitable partner. Secondly, I'm trying to build trust. And one doesn't help with the other. So we really have, I think there's probably a thin population. I think the space in between is more thinly populated. It's not just a continuum, but nevertheless, we have very different models there, and we have to select what it is we want the thing, what's fit for purpose. And then on the contracting side, some contracts are highly transactional. You will climb on and off a bus or in and out of a taxi, and those are contracts, and you don't even need to speak to the person. And then other contracts are highly relational, and we talked about this last week, so I won't go into much detail, but they depend very heavily on the social context and the nature of relationships and the quality of relationships, deeply dependent on that. And so again, we have very different models within this space, that it's not just one. My paperclips report. The next model is the corporate supply chain, and I think a lot of what government does, this is certainly true of the MOD, it's very much like a supply chain. You're engaging with suppliers who will be part of your system on and off for quite some time, and you're going to have deep relationships with them. In Australia, we're dominated. We have two supermarket chains that have really dominated. They about 15 years ago bought up a lot of their competitors. That's now being reversed, and they've pulled back to about 75% of the market, and they'll lose further market share with new entrants. One of them is Aldi, a German supplier, and Aldi are going to their potential supply chain, going to little people and saying, we'll give you long-term contracts and commitments as long as you will invest in building these capabilities. Now, why aren't they just outsourcing? Why aren't they just going to the market? Because the market's owned by their competitors. They have got to build their own supply chain independent. And if you think about it in those terms, you're in a different space. And sometimes, often, what government's doing is it's building a particular kind of capability that doesn't naturally exist out there in the ether. You've got to build it. And I think there used to be more of that, more awareness of that here when I was living here years ago. I see less of that now. I think there is more this view that there's just the market's out there and you just access it. The fact that you would want to shape it or build it to suit your purpose is less spoken of less often. I mean, this is the Nike point, of course. You are responsible for your supply chain. Just a quick illustration on this and the way that the private sector does this. So Benetton and Zara, you know, similar-ish space, you would think. Very different approaches to their supply chain. Benetton used to be the sort of pin-up for the virtual organisation approach. They really did very little production themselves. It was all networked manufacturing and distribution, and they really focused very heavily on dyeing, the sort of final stage, because it was all about colour and they'd move quick. They have moved a little bit more back in the direction of more direct control. Zara comes out of Spain and it's quite different. These guys come out of northern Italy. They've got a history that's 500 years old of independent production, small production, SME production. That's the way that northern Italy has worked for hundreds of years in the manufacture of clothing. Spain's quite different, much more a sort of a clientelistic approach. This guy wanted to create jobs in his local area. Half of the production is done in-house. They would manufacture in small batches, and articles would be priced before they were shipped. I mean, it's that much more control. Now, which of those is correct? Well, neither is correct for everybody. It's a case of using a range of different approaches to solve the problem that you've got to hand. Unfortunately, again, the supply chain literature is not brilliant. It gets very technical very quickly, the private sector supply chain literature. Contestability, I think of as a system. It's a particular kind of system, and we talked about that this morning, and this is a rather fascinating example of that. And then finally, and this, I've only added this into my slide pack recently because I've started doing some work on this, and that's the collaborative economy. You might sort of think, oh, that's a bit, you know, how's that relevant? Well, of course, Casserole Club is getting close into that space. But where I've been involved in it is on-demand transport. And I'm advising a Department of Transport committee on the procurement of pilots for on-demand transport. Now, these are going to fit halfway between Uber, halfway between taxis and Uber and buses. At one end, it's a very impersonal, by and large, a very impersonal exchange, and we're just buying off journey by journey. At the other end, it's a standardised route. Government commissions it and hands out a franchise. And this sort of fits in the middle, and it's going to cause disruption at both ends. The regulation down the taxi end is going to get more problematic, and the easy handing out of franchises up the bus end is going to get more problematic. And so we are finding ourselves now over in a space where, again, the models, the kinds of systems we think about and the way that we as government intervene is going to change and become much more complex. Before I move on to the NDIS case study, any sort of questions or comments at that point? I really was just wanting to make the point that we have here a number of different ways of thinking about what we're dealing with, and the word market doesn't quite get it if what we mean is commodity market, and it's not quite a supply chain. It's a particular kind of supply chain, more open, more contestable, ideally more contestable. Okay, so it's just sort of framing that. So,
Gary, can I pick up on that question about supply chain?
yeah.
I'm not a supply chain expert, but a lot of good practice seems to be anti-contestability. If you look at Japan or Korea or the sort of Deming view of the supply chain, it's formed long-term partnerships with a single provider wherever possible. But drive continual improvement and work with them to integrate closely and a whole bunch of other things.
Yep.
So that's interesting, isn't it? How does that fit?
So look, horses for courses. If you look at the clothing industry, I just gave you two. They are sort of classic studies. Government is dealing with. We'll look at NDIS in a minute. If it's a supply chain, it is a supply chain on such a massive scale, and in this case, you're offering direct relationships between the supplier and the end beneficiary. You're not going to be serving as an intermediary, although you will be commissioning certain aspects and designing certain aspects of it. So these are quite big and hairy, and if you take, say, the MOD, which is probably the government agency that gets closest to a supply chain approach, they can't afford to be beholden to any one supplier, but equally they can't. They're going to be dealing with two or three. So that even there, they sort of stand in a sort of a really interesting nether world, a sort of an interesting space in between. So these aren't just a supply chain, and I think any private company that was building a supply chain on the scale and complexity of, say, the NDIS, you'd be looking at building contestability and some sort of diversity India model so that you weren't as exposed to one supplier or one model.
And come to think of it, actually, benchmarking and all the tools that you talked about probably do apply in those places as well.
So that's right, benchmarking. You often find frameworks of those kind of where you're guaranteed the elements for a certain period of time, but the better you do, the more the share you'll get.
I know, for example, years ago, at the old institute, before I took it over and ran it, looked at a contract that Serco had with Marks and Spencer for FM contracts across their and what Marks and Spencer did is they split it into three regions. They benchmarked the three regions against each other, and if at any point one of those fell below par, they could seamlessly just hand it over to the best performing of the other two.
Gosh, somebody nicked that idea from the MOD facilities management supply chain, but it didn't work quite as well. How interesting, that's probably where it came from.
Right, so let's have a look at the National Disability Insurance Scheme. This is a massive shift from block funding to providers. On a very limited basis, that money was provided by the states, to the national government taking it over and funding individuals, personalised budgets, individual budgets, whatever we want to call it, based on the principle of self-directed care. And fundamental to this is the notion that and the reason why it was embraced so quickly by the populace at large and has been immediately embraced by the community around people with disabilities is because of what it gives, the way that it honours them. You're familiar with that here. Interestingly, some of my academic colleagues who are doing some work with the NDIA initially struggled with this goal, which is to assist individuals to live an ordinary life. And it was sort of like, well, shouldn't it be more than that? And it's like, well, no, you see, they just like to live an ordinary life, which is, I think, a really interesting and profound insight into what this is doing. And it's really it's about inclusion. It's about empowering these people to be included in what's going on in the community. And it's about helping them to have the ability to achieve their goals, not goals that were decided for them by government. And across their lifetime is the other element of that. It's sort of based on an insurance principle, which I'll talk about in a minute. And the idea is that we can invest more heavily at an early stage in order to make their life more meaningful at a later stage. So that's the sort of underlying logic that will be familiar to many of you. It funds, the term in the legislation is reasonable and necessary supports. That includes equipment for Australians with permanent and significant disability. It funds supports for people who meet the early intervention criteria or the insurance principles, so particularly young people, in order to help them acquire certain capabilities for later in life. Funding is not means tested. We do a lot of means testing in Australia. We're sort of an awful lot of it. We're very good at it. Sort of we mock middle class welfare, but this sort of stands as quite a different principle, of course. There's a planning process which matches scheme participants with supports, the supports they'll need. It involves conversations between the participant and the NDIA and agents on their behalf to ascertain goals and aspirations and needs, level of function and so on. So that's sort of an assessment process. The quality of the planning process is a key determinant of the success and long-term sustainability of the scheme. It's both important in terms of obviously making sure that people get what they need, but the financial viability of this scheme is heavily built on that process working well too. Now, the Productivity Committee is a government think tank, a highly respected government think tank in Australia, which did the original report on this, which led to the NDIS, has just literally, just as I was coming away, handed down a report on its implementation thus far. And I'll be referring to that in a number of places here. To meet the needs of NDIS participants, there must be a significant increase in the quantity, range and responsiveness of disability supports. The shift in the business model from a block-funded to a fee-for-service environment is highly challenging for many. That's the sort of nice summary of what's going on the supply side. It is an uncapped scheme, so we are moving from what essentially was an old-fashioned welfare culture to reasonable necessary supports, and that is fundamental to reducing the total cost of disability over the lifetime of the individual and increasing service coverage, more people, more supports, without significantly increasing costs beyond what more than that expected, and we'll come to that.
So it's literally uncapped, there's no limit to how much?
It's an important question because the old state schemes were capped. Here's $5 billion, and when it runs out, there isn't any more. Treasury has perfect control. Treasury has, at the moment, I'll come back on this, virtually no controls.
Sounds like student finance. Bit, you know.
We're going to come onto an Australian case study of that.
Yeah.
It is.
It's a way of increasing.
Well, yeah. Look. It was certainly designed to expand, but I have challenged Treasury officials around Australia on this repeatedly. Their first responsibility is to get a vote of money from the Parliament. Their second responsibility is to protect the fisc. Those are the first two jobs of a Treasury. In this particular program, they have no experience or tools in protecting the fisc under this kind of a scheme. And we'll see that as a problem with the
An uncapped scheme will overspend massively. The
Won't it?
Cancer Drugs Fund, I think it had an exponential rate of growth, literally.
You'll see some of that. You'll see some. Guess what? We've had the same problems.
Gary, why is the ambition to increase service coverage?
Sorry?
Why was the ambition to increase service coverage?
Because, frankly, there was a whole lot of people who needed support who weren't getting it.
They felt that those people were underserved.
I don't think there's any doubt that people were underserved.
And was that people were not getting access to services, that people were not getting access to enough services?
Yeah, all of that. Yep. There just wasn't enough money in the system to cover. Now, we now get into the question to cover what, because that's the problem. Is that how do you define legitimate need? Here becomes an issue, and we'll see some of that as we go through. So here's its sort of history. It's been very fast. I mean, the Productivity Commission report came as, at least for the public of Australia and the politicians and the public servants, as a bit of a surprise. The heads of agreement were signed by national state governments the next year. Legislation was passed the following year. The first trial sites were launched that same year, and full implementation will be in place by 2019, 2020. So it's moving at a cracking pace. There was existing state funding of 6.5 billion across all the states. That was to increase to 13.6 billion. The federal government was to top up the rest. It started with 4 trial sites. That expanded to 9. Full rollout began 15 months ago. It is to reach almost 500,000 people by 2020. Currently there's 122,000 signed up. The current estimated cost of the first full year of operation is 22 billion.
What was the budget again? 13.
That's about what the UK is spending this over here.
So this is, here's your phase up, trial phase and transition. As you can see, they're already falling a bit behind. We'll just come on to that in a minute. But this is fast. They're moving. This is a massive. One of the things about this is that one of the things people said to me, they've said it repeatedly in a lot of places, is that this is the most complex voucher scheme we've done since the Medicare card. I said, not. Medicare card was a payment system. The supply system, the GPs, was already firmly in place. It was a model we well understood. It was, the pharmaceutical benefit scheme and the medical benefit scheme and the payment schedules all established. All we did was introduce a new payment mechanism brokered through the national government. This, in order of magnitude, is more complex by hundreds and hundreds of percent.
Given that the projections are there and you're falling slightly behind those projections, what is the reason for almost doubling the cost in the first year? Is it just that everyone's getting more than they anticipate?
We'll come on to that. So, Productivity Commission, positive reception, right? I mean, just generally people feel good about it, and for people for whom the scheme is designed, there's been overwhelmingly a positive result, positive reception. There's some snagging problems. I think some of them are pretty big snagging problems, but there's some snagging problems. This is actually a mother who appeared on the ABC television with 2 sons with autism. But one of the comments that night, it's like a couple of weeks ago, it's a fair point, okay? This is a big complex system. There's going to be some issues. So we get that. That's fair enough. This was a very prominent charity. Unfortunately, the need to achieve high growth in numbers appears to be outweighing considerations of plan quality and consistency. So they're already behind on the numbers, and they're going. This is just one quote. There's numerous quotes. This is the quality of what's being offered in terms of designing a plan is problematic. So now this was a scheme. I don't remember. I think the Productivity Commission, I think, was way too ambitious about timescale, but they recommended a particular timescale with proper pilots, not just trial sites. The trial sites, there was never any question it was going to be. They were going to stop and learn from them. They were just early rollouts. The politicians accelerated the time frame because this is a good thing, so a good thing quicker can only be a good thing, hey? An even better thing. Again, the Productivity Commission, the NDIA has focused too much on quantity, meeting participant intake estimates, and not enough on quality, planning processes, supporting infrastructure and market development. So there are a couple of other elements there. This is the ABC News then. A little earlier, advocates said people with neurological problems or mental illnesses were among those impacted by the lack of face-to-face meetings. I didn't find it really respectful that people who just phoned to go through what was essentially a really large life plan. Disability organisations said NDIS plans developed over the phone often left people without services and equipment they needed. In order to try to keep up with the numbers, they're hitting the phones, but even when they do have meetings, there's a consistent narrative, fairly consistent narrative of I didn't think they were listening to me. Participant intake is not matching original estimates, so they're not coming in at the rate that they thought. There are supply shortages, which they think will persist for some time. Many participants will need more time and assistance to know how to control their supports. They don't have the skills or the knowledge to know how to control the suppliers who are now working for them directly. And so there's a worry that there's going to be a bit too much supplier control in this process and not enough beneficiary control. And the view is that this will reduce, because there isn't that control, it's going to reduce competitive pressure. Competition is not going to work in the magic way that the economists thought it would. So the 13.6 billion is already at least 22 billion. And this is a very significant economic commentator who has a slot in the ABC News at night, and he's wonderful. It's a racing certainty, he said, in fact, that the 22 billion is only the start and that it will blow out a lot further from there. There is the problem of latent demand, that you trigger demand that was asleep, and that's a huge issue here. And when I have raised that with the NDIA, the National Disability Insurance Agency, their response has been, but we've hired actuaries, and we'll talk about to which my response was, don't hire political scientists, because these boundary questions and these definitional questions will be fought out in the papers, and in the political debate it's not science, it won't be dealt with scientifically, and you'll see an example of that in a minute. So there's insufficient assessment staff, there's insufficient delivery staff, lack of competition among suppliers, and political pressures on the limits to access already. So of the 8.9 billion additional costs, 6.4 billion is due to pay rises awarded to community services employees. Well, hey, you've got all this additional money now. There's slippage at the 65. Now if you develop, one of the threshold problems is that if you develop your condition prior to 65, then you're in the NDIS. If your condition emerges after you're 65, you miss out. I just don't think that's a boundary that's going to hold.
Do you get to keep it if you're 64? Once you turn 65, do you get to keep it now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just an entry point in 65.
So what happens to the over 65-year-olds then?
Oh, they fall into another scheme.
A different scheme, right? So the whole idea is that if you put lots of money into people up front,
that's part of the idea.
They'll need less money.
Look, it's about those two things. Part of it is that it is what's called an insurance principle, and we'll come onto that in a minute. The idea that if I invest early, it's early intervention. Part of it is that. Another part of it is the choice point, the dignity associated with you choosing who will and what mix of services should be provided. So this is Alan Kohler, that business commentator I mentioned to you. Was he? You remember Alan Kohler? So he's got a slot in the ABC News at night where he talks about gives the financial report, the business report. He's really good, delivered with an enormously dry tone. I thought this was a pretty good description. The National Disability Insurance Scheme is like that renovation you embarked on and found after you were well into it that the stumps were rotten, the sewers were all blocked and the roof needed replacing. Too late to turn back, you had to tear up the budget and press on. That's, I think, a pretty good summary of where we have found ourselves and will find ourselves. Okay, reasons for concern, for deeper concern. The number of children entering the scheme is higher than expected. That means more cost. The number of people approaching the scheme in trial sites that have been operating the longest is higher than would be expected if they were only people with newly acquired conditions. That suggests you've got latent demand being triggered. The longer it's there, the more latent demand it triggers. The number of participants exiting the scheme is lower than expected, particularly for children entering under the early intervention requirements. Not looking terrific, is it? Levels of committed support tend to increase as participants move into their second and third plans. Now the product, I argue, I have a friend of mine who's one of the commissioners on the Productivity Commission, and I said to him that they were not the correct body to be conducting this review because they would not have the guts to call it out as cleanly as it should, because it's their baby, and that's pretty much eventuated. If you read, this is coming from their report, you read what they're saying in their report, and then the tone of the seriousness with which they addressed the questions, and they're pulling their punches. There needs to be somebody speaking truth to power on this. No one has experience in the creation of an entirely new market on this scale. No one in Australia. Not on this scale. This is just huge and numerically and phenomenally complex. There's no one to go to. I mean, every consultant in Australia, and I'm pleased to say we're now sharing the work, maybe sharing the work with some people in the UK. Every consultant in Australia has done work for them on this, because they've just, and I've seen some of those reports, and some of them are pretty ordinary. Another reason for concern, it is estimated that 1 in 5 jobs in the Australian economy over the next few years will need to be in disability care. And at the moment we're not capable of, we don't have the capability to step it up to meet that. Now what does that mean? A mismatch, a fundamental mismatch between supply and demand. And what happens when you have too much demand and too little supply? The national government has virtually no experience in practical implementation of policy. So while I was overseas, about 2010, the Labor government, it was designed to try to help our economy deal with the global financial crisis. And one of the things they did was to offer everyone in Australia extraordinarily cheap home insulation. Pink bats, it's the standard product in Australia, a pink insulation product, and they set that scheme up because they had to get the money out there quickly, and managed to create several problems: massive rorting on amongst the supply chain, and
Gary, I think that's an Australian word.
You don't use that word.
No.
Oh, okay, ripping off.
Yeah, okay.
And they killed 4 young men. They basically had the industry had no capability, so they were putting untrained young men into roofs with electrics, and 4 young men were killed. The Royal Commission by a judge, it ought to have been obvious to any competent administration that such an exponential increase in work to be undertaken would require a similarly huge increase in the workforce to do it. It ought to also have been obvious to any competent administration that the injection of a large amount of money into an industry that is largely unregulated would carry with it the risk of rorting and other unscrupulous behaviour. They got both. Because they just had the federal government to this day. I mean, they don't run things. They just shift money around. And we've got them now dealing with the design of I mean, no state government has the capacity to think through the issues. The federal government. You wind up in the hands of Treasury economists, if I can be blunt, for whom a wave of the arm, the market will fix this, is the natural sort of response. Now, some constitutional problems, and that's all sort of short-term problems maybe, and problems that are unique to Australia. Let's talk about some of the sort of underlying issues that might help you think about how you think about these sort of problems. At the time, it took them a little while to work out what kind of a system it was, and so the original thinking around this came out of a thing out of New South Wales called the Lifetime Care and Support Authority. And it was the realisation in New South Wales that when people have an automobile accident and are profoundly disabled as a result of that, they are not an insurance problem anymore, they're a welfare problem. And that you didn't, if you removed those people out of the insurance system, you would lower the cost of insurance. You would in no way increase moral hazard. You wouldn't change the behaviour of people in relation to it. Nobody's going to fake, quadriplegia. And you increase the likelihood that these people would get early intervention to address their needs. If you made them the responsibility of a state agency, then you would be stepping in earlier to begin to address their needs. That's a hugely important insight, and it's somebody thinking very cleverly about two different sorts of systems. There's a market for insurance, but this isn't a problem that actually fits within that market and the design issues. Great piece of analysis as far as it went. And then it occurred to them, what if we applied that to people born with a disability? The trouble with that is they're utterly different problems, completely different problems. Because people born with a disability, it's not an insurance issue. It may be an early intervention issue, but it's not an insurance issue. So as a result, the NDIS is built on this, provides universal coverage by pooling risk across all Australians. Well, what risk is that? I mean, it's not, we're dealing, I mean, it's the prospect, the possibility that someone in the community might be born with a problem, but I don't know that we normally see that as a risk problem in that sense. And taking the risk of disability support away from individuals. So that has resulted in a couple of things. Actuarial estimates of long-term costs. They've got a lot of actuaries crunching numbers, and okay, it's nice somebody's doing that, but it's not going to fundamentally alter the efficiency or the performance of this particular system. And a lifetime view of participant needs with early investment. Oh, okay, well that's an early intervention problem. I don't quite know that it's an insurance problem per se. So it was thought about, it took them a while to realise this is actually a voucher scheme. Primarily it's a voucher scheme. And as a result it took a while to begin to think through the architectural question. So this question of what kind of problem am I dealing with? What is the system that I'm engaged with, and what particular kinds of architecture is going to be relevant to the system I'm dealing with is a really interesting and important one. So they were not thinking through the questions of architecture anywhere near early enough. I still don't know that they've done enough work on that. Another interesting problem, a demand-driven approach creates problems of definition. So there's the age one, which I mentioned before. But there's also this definition around disability. So what of mental illness? Mental illness, the people in the mental illness community are really struggling with this. This is doesn't really work for them. But the other category of people is those with cognitive impairment. Now this is people who, in a sense, I sort of sum them up as people who aren't coping with the 21st century awfully well. They probably didn't cope with the 20th century. In a quieter, gentler world, in village life, they probably would have been nested and reinforced by community in a more supportive way. And their problem is not easily categorisable, because it may turn up as homelessness, or it may turn up as suicide, or drug abuse, or it may be criminality. Quite how it manifests itself is quite dispersed. Now, not only do these people just not fit, it gets a little bit worse than that. When I spoke to the guy who, in the New South Wales prison system, who looks after people with disabilities, he said it's worse than that, because they now have to turn up and collect a card that says disabled, if you like. They've already got it. They don't want that card. The ones he deals with, they've already got a card that says criminal, and they'd much rather have a card that says criminal than one that says I'm disabled. They just don't want to be categorised that way. And that's sort of the product of moving from a supply-driven system where supports were provided as and when needed, to a demand-driven model where you have a card, which is a really interesting insight. And it's even more complex than that. I have a niece with Williams syndrome, and she's just discovered a boy who lives a couple of villages away, little suburbs, I suppose, whatever you'd call it, who's got Williams syndrome, and she identifies with him. But she doesn't want to hang around with all those other funny people. You know, the definition of disability is even, you know, she has an awareness that she has a disability, but the way that we define people is enormously important in this, and NDIS, a voucher system, requires you to have a card that declares you, announces you in a particular way. And that, I don't know whether I go into this later on, but for people with cognitive impairment, the system could just throw support to them as it was recognised and needed. It can't do that now. The state has walked away. And there isn't a supply side in that same sense, with the state being a provider and engaging with not-for-profits, to just throw supports in as required. Now, that was ad hoc, and I suppose perhaps for people with profound intellectual disability that was inefficient, but for people with cognitive impairment that wasn't necessarily an inefficient way of dealing with it, because we can't categorise it. So it's how we think about the problem actually turns out to be quite important here. There was then, in putting it into the legislation, one of the states, South Australia, argued that the term for children ought to be global developmental delay, and another state, Victoria, strongly argued as a condition of entry that it should be developmental delay. Problem with that is that the word developmental delay doesn't mean anything. The word global developmental delay is a quite specific term. You're nodding your head, you're familiar with this. This is a quite specific term. One of the reasons why there's a blowout amongst young people is that they've included a term, for the sake of arriving at a political compromise, they've included a term that has no meaning, that is open-ended.
So it means if you have dyslexia or something, you could be on the scheme then?
Certainly people on the spectrum, that question, that becomes hugely problematic, because that's the place, the trial site where they've done most work on that is where they've had the biggest blowout in that. So it looks like that this one thing is going to be hugely important. So, you know, what seemed like a let's agree on this, you know, amongst the politicians and the amateur policymakers sitting around a table, let's agree on this to get Victoria on board, actually has built, if you like, a virus, coded a virus into the system right at its fundamental level.
How is it determined that somebody has a disability at all? Is it some kind of test by the government? Is there a needs test?
Well, there is an assessment process, but obviously the quality of that assessment process, of which this is an example, the quality of that assessment process becomes enormously important.
What we found with children who are at infant stage, where they haven't actually got a diagnosis or anything called development delay, so they then have a disability, but they haven't actually been diagnosed with something as yet. They know something's not right, but so I know for our numbers it has gone quite a bit.
So what you're saying is that you're observing this as well. That's interesting, isn't it? I mean, there is just... Sorry.
My old days as a speech pathologist, developmental delay is defined as anyone who is slightly delayed behind what you would expect for a child of that age comparable. Global developmental delay would tend to, is a delay against everything, and therefore normally what we might call a learning disability or big problems. But you can have a developmental delay, particularly in speech and language, and again, percentage-wise, anything where your motor skills being a little bit slow, your speech and language, your social skills being a little bit slow long before you were defined on a autistic spectrum. So yeah, you're not even talking about, I don't know, a 20 or 30% increase, are you? You're talking about 80% increase, 10-fold increase in diagnosis just by taking the word global away from it.
And it's now going to place much greater pressure on the people who, the doctors and others who are the gatekeepers. Just phenomenal pressure on them. And that's a really unfair pressure to place on people who are interfacing immediately and directly.
But you've also absolutely cemented in absolutely medical model of disability to the extent that it's just the social model has obviously not been near the debate, and the entitlement model rather than about enablement. So you've created this loss frame for people to think about fighting for their rights now instead of fighting to be able to do whatever they want to do.
So, I mean, the other thing that occurs in this, which I may come back on to later on, is that the popularity of this has stolen all the oxygen from the room for example, the people working in cognitive impairment. So the funding's gone, and the willingness for the moment to pay attention to the problems that they're raising has also gone. Because, hey, we've done it, we've fixed it, haven't we? And so a particular model which was built heavily around, I suppose, physical intellectual impairment, although one of the women I'm working with on this on-demand transport project she said she's got a daughter who's intellectually fine but physically severely disabled, and she said it's been enormously problematic just for her. And I mean, her daughter falls squarely within the sort of comfortable definition of what this was meant to be about. So it's but over in this other space, I mean, both mental illness to some extent, but I mean the people working in the cognitive impairment space, it's a really sad story, because as I said, the supports have gone because the money went off to NDIA, and they just can't. I mean, people sort of nod their heads and are knowing, but they just can't get attention. Now, there's just a little bit of attention being shown at state level now, because these is going to turn up in more people in prison or more people homeless. It's going to the loss of that support is going to manifest itself in additional costs elsewhere in the system.
Was one of the objectives also to include sort of other sort of social prescribing sort of models? You know, one example from self-directed support in the UK was someone horse riding, for example, because that's something they already wanted to do, and that was great for their well-being and met their prescription, if you like, their plan. Was the aim to achieve that as well, and therefore did you have the issues with the political dimension? Because I think that was sometimes the fear in councils I was only involved in the really early days. But you know, there was the big headline about, you know, taxpayers are paying for horse riding lessons, and that kind of reaction.
Yeah, look, at the moment that hasn't surfaced. I suspect still a little early, and they're probably drawing it a bit tight. The one I always remember was access to a sex worker, which at one level you can go, yep, I can understand that might be actually the best thing you could provide for that person, but there are some political constraints about that. And the problem when it's uncapped, essentially, I mean, it'll be capped for the individual, but because the scheme is uncapped, it becomes enormously problematic then for the gatekeeper. And there is this issue about, at one point somebody in the NDIA were talking to me, it might have been at a political level, somebody was talking to me about designing a market for the gatekeeper role. And I said, well, I wouldn't suggest you do it to start with. And the architectural challenges around that, and we know this from a lot of other schemes, is that the people who are down at the front line interfacing with the individual don't care at all about your budget. They really do not care. Doesn't matter whether it's public or private sector, everyone has exactly the same problems, because they're doing what they're doing because they feel for other human beings. So they will conspire with the recipient against the system. And there's quite a good literature about this phenomenon, and it's one of the reasons our system sort of works. But if you're relying very heavily on the gatekeeper as effectively the source of limiting cost, then that's extraordinarily dangerous. So there is, again, in the sort of their enthusiasm for market solutions, they were sort of, I mean, you've had some experience with outsourcing that gatekeeper role, and it is fraught with problems. So, I mean, this is some of the stuff I've touched on. A demand-driven approach, funding is determined by need rather than a fixed budget. Not necessarily a problem, but it means that you don't have, I mean, that requires a sophisticated understanding of need and new control mechanisms. And treasuries have a little of the first, some of the first and very little of the second. I mean, I happen to believe in the treasury role. It is extraordinarily important, and as we'll see in an example I'll give, which in a more developed market, it's they really have problems with these alternative models. So this is the oxygen from the room point. So no one has experience in the design of complex voucher systems. This is the vet market, and there are two sort of phases to this. It began a Labor government kicking it off. We have a traditional in Australia of Labor governments liking market type models. 2008, the Victorian state government introduced choice in vocational training, initially only at diploma level. Enrolments amongst 15-year-olds increased by 37%, and there was improvements in job placement. So not without its benefits, what you'd expect. Enrolments in marginal courses immediately soared. The annual cost of the scheme blew out by more than $1 billion. In a state budget in Australia, that's a significant sum of money. It was copied in South Australia, and theirs blew out by a comparable amount. This is the latent demand problem. And on the one hand, people were accessing schemes that were more useful to them. Suppliers were also very good at developing makeshift schemes. In 2010, the Victorian Auditor General reported widespread abuse, laptops being offered to new enrollees. Hey, I can get a free laptop. 2-year courses completed in 5 days of study. In 2014, 10,000 students, 5% of the total, that year alone, had their qualifications recalled over standards. There's a problem. Now, the federal government got involved, and this was about lending money to these people, extending loans, student loans to them. 2009, they extended it to vocational education, initially just within the public system, and then in 2012 they opened it to private providers with no controls on content or fees and limited regulation of providers, because what capacity do they have to regulate suppliers? They don't do that stuff. And here's the headlines at its height, 2015-16. These are sort of some of the headlines